With the Second World War at its peak, Germany developed a great need for more machines to support producing war materials. Smaller class steam locomotives, like the Class A1, which is a pre-war steam locomotive, were perfect to fulfill that need. Especially for heavier industries, a slightly changed up version of this class would be created. A specific locomotive was built by the Maschinenfabrik Esslingen. One of these industrial versions of the Class A1, now known as Hoogovensstoom IJmuiden, HSY 57, would start its working life in 1943. One of its first large employers would be the harbour of Duisburg. Sadly, this all would be cut short when a bombing raid would hit the harbour. One bomb landed close to number 57, damaging it severely and flipping it onto its side. Eventually, the machine would be restored to its original state, well, almost original. If you look closely and observe the locomotive frames and running board, several dents and damage caused by the bombing can be seen. This locomotive still carries the scars of its wartime service. Before we continue with more history, let's have a look at the performance and statistics of this machine. At a length of 10.5 meters and a weight of 67 tons, this Green Goblin is a masterpiece of German engineering. Even though the driving wheels are relatively small and not all too numerous, the machine is very powerful and perfect for its main task, which is industrial work. At a maximum speed of about 50 km an hour, this locomotive is the perfect package of power and decent speed. After the Second World War, the HSY 57 would be sold and bought by several different industrial owners, only to end up at the Hoogovens IJmuiden in 1972 as a gift. The machine was gifted because of a locomotive exchange between the Hoogovens and the different industry in Germany. From 1973 onwards, the Hoogovensstoom IJmuiden would operate visitor excursion trains on the industrial terrain. During its service in IJmuiden, the locomotive would also receive a nickname, Bonne, which is also the first name of one of the former directors of the Hoogovens. A second locomotive would join HSY 57 not long afterwards. This one is called HSY 22 and has the nickname Tom. The Hoogovens IJmuiden would change in name and owner, now called Tata Steel. Due to changes being implemented by this new owner, the excursion trains on the former Hoogovens tracks came to a halt in 2022. This meant that both Bonne and Tom needed a new place to stay. For HSY 57 Bonne, this would be the Miljoenenlijn, formerly known as the Zuid-Limburgse Stoomtreinmaatschappij in Limburg, the Netherlands. It still remains there today, operating on the Heritage Railway. At the turn of the century, the Swedish State Railways (SJ) decided they wanted to experiment with something relatively new: superheaters. The superheaters would circulate steam longer before it would reach the cylinders. This meant that the steam would become even hotter and would have a higher amount of energy, which would increase the power output of the locomotive. All in all, better performance. In need of a new class of mixed traffic locomotive, the SJ would order the E-class, all equipped with these new superheaters. The locomotive, now known as the E2 1040, would also be built back in 1910. Then with the name E1040. The two would be added later after a rebuild. It would pull both stop services and be used for heavier goods services, but not for express passenger work, as the E-class was nowhere quick enough for that sort of thing. Sadly, this slow speed would hamper it from staying relevant into the later 1930s, and changes needed to be made. To understand the changes, let's talk about numbers a bit. The E-Class locomotive, at a weight of 83 tons with an 080 wheel arrangement and a frame of 16.5 meters long, was able to reach speeds up to 65 kilometers an hour. When comparing the E-Class with other mainline steam locomotives, this indeed is too slow. The Swedish decided that the speed and stability at high speed needed to be improved. This is what they did. They moved the boiler 25 centimeters to the front of the machine, added one more axle in front, a dull axle, mind you, and they added an entire meter in length to the frame, making it now a total of 17.5 meters long. With a slightly increased weight of 90 tons and the designation now officially being changed to E2, these machines would magically be capable of reaching 70 kilometers an hour. Still, not all too impressive, but it shows you what a little bit of Swedish ingenuity can achieve. After the change from E-Class to E2 class, the locomotives would extend their lives with quite some time, as the Swedish would keep the E2 class in service until 1972, when most of them would be withdrawn from service. In almost all European countries, withdrawn steam locomotives would get sent to the cutter's torch and scrapped soon after their last official rides. However, this was not the case in Sweden. The E2 1040 was adopted by the military and was added to the strategic reserve just in case war rendered electric or diesel locomotives unusable. It would remain in Sweden until 1989. Badly beaten and in disrepair, the E2 1040 was bought by one of the youngest heritage railways in the Netherlands, the Miljoenenlijn, back then known as the Zuid-Limburgse Stoomtreinmaatschappij. The locomotive would be brought to Simpelveld by rail, travelling all the way from Sweden, then through Germany, and finally into the Netherlands. 3 more Swedish machines would be purchased by the Miljoenenlijn, but sadly, none of them are in running condition today. After refurbishment in Simpelveld, the E2 1040 would start operations, and it is still in running condition today. Since 2023 it has been put into reserve, however, as it is close to needing a total overhaul. It now and again can be seen under its own power during special events, like the Miljoenenlijn Stoomtreindagen. Honestly, it is a true pity that none of the other remaining Swedish machines are operational, as they are very close to examples of Swedish locomotives in Dutch service post-war. I might be slightly biased here though, as this is easily my favourite steam locomotive still alive and kicking on the Dutch heritage railway scene. Still, having any of these old machines running is a sight for sore eyes. Before the formation of the Swiss Federal Railways, the SBB, Switzerland would have multiple main railways. 2 or 3 of these railways would receive the class E3/3, an 060 tank engine for shunting duties. 118 examples of the machine were built by the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works, the first in 1896 and the last batch in 1915. The Swiss railways had been struggling with supplying their largest stations and industrial hubs with shunters, mostly relying on mainline engines to do the work that they were never supposed to do in the first place. One of these class E3/3 locomotives, the 2079, built in 1911, will be pivotal to this story later on in our episode. Let's have a look at the statistics of the locomotive to illustrate why this little thing was just perfect for the work it was assigned to do. The class E3/3 has an overall weight of 33 tons, is about 8.5 meters long, and has a very tightly compressed wheelbase, enabling it to take very tight corners. The little tank engine could reach speeds up to 45 kilometers an hour, which was more than enough. Just imagine rattling along the tracks in one of these tiny chuffers even quicker. You might get thrown off the footplate. During the Second World War, this very series of locomotives fell victim to strange experiments. Due to a shortage of coal, 2 of the class E3/3 locomotives were converted to electrical heating. This meant the locomotives were equipped with pantographs to tap electricity from the overhead wires, which was used to generate steam instead of using coal. Most of the class would remain in service all the way to the 1960s. Although quite some time has passed since then, you can still find 26 Class E3/3 examples that have been preserved to this day. Now, the history of the Class E3/3 in the Netherlands would only start after the Second World War. Due to shortages in equipment, several machines would be imported from Switzerland. 2 Class E3/3 locomotives were ordered to start helping in the Rotterdam port, receiving Dutch Railways NS numbers 7851 and 7852. There wouldn't follow any more examples of the class, and all would be withdrawn in 1948. Yet, as you might remember, the preserved example bears the number 7853. Then how does that work? Well, let me tell you the magical story of how Dutch Heritage Railway added a non-existent locomotive to a class no longer around. The machine, now known as the NS 7853, would start its life as 2079. It would start service immediately after being built in 1911 at the aluminium plant at Suisse in Switzerland. It received its own number, 4, and was named after the nearby river, Navizence. Even though most of her class were withdrawn in the 60s, Navizence would remain in service until 1982. Because it had been maintained well and kept in running condition, the machine was preserved in the Landesmuseum für Technik und Arbeit in Mannheim. By 1996, negotiations between Mannheim and the Museum Buurtspoorweg (MBS) would reach an agreement. Navizence would go to the Netherlands. Since 2005, Navizence has been running on the MBS heritage line between Boekerlo and Haaksberg, as a reminder of how disappearing heritage can be brought back to life. From the very start of the railways, steam locomotives served in a very industrial role. In general, industrial railways are known to have tight curves, and thus locomotives with a large wheelbase were not desirable and prone to derailing. When a Belgian industry, the ironworks Hoboken Overpelt, were looking for industrial machines to serve their railway-related needs, they would order a small 040 tank engine. By 1924, the Atelier de Construction de la Meuse, a Belgian locomotive manufacturer, would start developing a series of small tank engines fit for industrial use. These locomotives were designed with an open backside cab, which meant that the driver and fireman of the machine had excellent visibility. Big problem: once the weather turns sour, so do the people on the footplate. That might be the biggest downside of this entire design. In the year 1925, one example of this 040 tank engine was delivered to the Ironworks Hoboken Overpelt, Magda. From the moment of being delivered to the ironworks, Magda would start serving as the designated shunter. The small tank engine would be ironworks property all the way until the 1980s, when it was bought by a private owner. Mind you, the machine was still operational. In stark contrast to most other locomotives that we have discussed to this point, Magda is one that doesn't easily evade you. Remember that line about compensating? Well, that will show in this section regarding the statistics and performance of this little tank engine. Magda is the lightest of the locomotives in this series, because she only has a weight of 22 tons. Speed is also not something she chases, as she tops out at a speed of 30 kilometers an hour. When researching for this machine, I couldn't find any official data on the length from buffer to buffer, but it can't be much more than roughly 4 or 5 meters. Another characteristic attribute, just like the cab with open backside, is how incredibly cost-efficient Magda is. According to the Museum Buurtspoorweg, the MBS, this little tank engine is very economical when it comes to the amount of coal it uses when going up and down the line. This is a handy attribute for an industrial steam locomotive. I might like it even more if it were just any other color. After being purchased by the private owner, Magda would be shown to the public once again. The little machine would start operations on the Belgian toeristische trein Zolder Heritage Railway. Sadly, this heritage railway would close down in 1989. Luckily, it did not take long for the locomotive to be saved once more, as it was acquired by the Museum Buurtspoorweg MBS in 1995. By 1998, a major overhaul would be started. It was here that Magda would receive an entirely new boiler, her MBS number 6, and her dreadful color scheme. The yellow that Magda is so well known for is meant to represent the color schemes used by the Nederlandse Centraal Spoorwegmaatschappij, the NCS. As no locomotives of the NCS were preserved, Magda would become a living memory of something that no longer exists. To this day, it is common to see Magda run between Haaksbergen and Boekelo. Good thing is, when train spotting, it is hard to not see this train approaching. Can't miss it. We start our history segment in the year 1941. In this year, 2 prototypes of what would become the Class 23 were constructed. These would be called the BR-23 Alt. Then the war hit the pause button on further development, which would only be picked up again in the early 50s. In the year 1950, the newly formed Deutsche Bundesbahn, DB, would start developing one of their most successful classes of steam locomotives ever. The Class 23 was built in 2 separate batches. The SSN 23023 belongs to the very first batch, whilst the VSM 23071 and 23076 belong to the second batch. With all kinds of new technology available for both steam and diesel traction, a number of the Class 23 would be equipped with a great new feature. When coupled to the correct rolling stock, they could be operated in a push-pull configuration. This meant that the driver could stand in the front carriage and control the engine, whilst the locomotive pushed the train from the back. Due to the new features, the Class 23 would be built until 1959, when West Germany would stop producing steam locomotives altogether. Funnily enough, the honour of being the last ever produced steam locomotive in West Germany goes to a Class 23, the 23105. If this short segment of general history was not enough to convince you of how magnificent these machines are, let me try by elaborating even further. Part of why these locomotives are still around is because of the way they were designed and the job they were made to do. At a length of 21 meters and a weight of 82 tons, this 262 locomotive is capable of reaching speeds up to 110 kilometers an hour. The weight of both locomotive and a filled tender can even top the 130 tons. If you ask me, the combination of this speed and weight distribution is more than perfect for the task it was built for, pulling both express passenger services and stop services. Combine it with the unique way some of the machines could be operated, and you have the perfect local passenger locomotive package. Built in 1952, the 23023 was part of the first batch of steam locomotives to be produced by the Deutsche Bundesbahn, DB. Built by Arnold Jung Lokomotivfabrik, the 023 would enter service in the very same year it was built. During its life, the machine would receive a different number once, between 1969 and 1975, with a -5 being added to the end of the locomotive number. In 1976, the O23 would be purchased by the Stoomstichting Nederland, SSN, and would be brought over to Rotterdam the very same year. The locomotive would momentarily be pulled from active service in 1984, when the boiler ticket expired. Nowadays, the locomotive is fitted with the automatische treinbeïnvloeding, ATB. The ATB is a security system that is fitted to all modern Dutch trains, trying to avoid major train crashes from happening. Both the O71 and O76 were built as part of the second batch in 1956, also by the Arnold Jung Locomotieffabriek. These locomotives would do service for the Deutsche Bundesbahn until 1975, with both examples being bought by the Veluwse Stoomtreinmaatschappij VSM. Just like with the O23, the O71 and O76 both carry different numbers, with the O71 having an extra -4 added to the back of the number, and O76 having an extra -3. These numbers would be changed because the Deutsche Bundesbahn started using a new digitalized system, and these numbers were more computer-friendly. The O76 was the first one to be bought and transferred in 1976, whilst the O71 would be brought over in 1977. Both VSM Class 23 locomotives are also fitted with the ATB system, often being seen on the main line together alongside the SSN 23023 and SSN 01-1075. But also during special occasions such as Terug naar Toen and during the SSN Stoomtreindagen. After the Second World War, the Dutch railways would push a modernization agenda, wishing to push out steam locomotives as quickly as possible. The NS would order 95 electrical and 267 diesel-electric locomotives. Amongst these diesels that were ordered was also the class NS 2200. This series of diesel locomotives was built specifically for heavy cargo traffic and serving large harbours. A total of 150 machines were built and were an amalgamation of Allen in Rotterdam and Stork and Hemaf in Hengelo. The final batch of similar-looking NS Class 2300 locomotives would be built by Schneider in Germany instead. Just look at the sheer size of these things. Magnificent. Now, it is very easy to see why these beasts would easily fulfill the roles first occupied by steam locomotives. The machine is a whopping 14 meters long, which is incredible for Dutch-made diesel locomotives. The NS 2200 is equipped with 2 bogies, both with 2 axles. This kind of wheel arrangement is called a bow-bow configuration. The diesel weighs 72 tons and has a maximum speed of 100 kilometers an hour. For those of us interested in petrol-related tractive power, the locomotive is capable of producing 900 horsepower. This meant that, for a long time, these diesels were the most powerful engines of the Dutch railways. The fact that they look American makes it even more ironic that they can be operated in an American way too. You could couple up to 4 NS 2200s in tandem for the very heavy cargo trains. True powerhouses. Now, let's return to the locomotive at the center of this episode, the NS 2215. The 2215 was built in the year 1955 by Allen and pulled into service almost immediately. Whilst being put into service in a brownish-red colour, it would be repainted between 1971 and 1986 as part of the Spoorslag 70. It would receive the yellow-grey colour scheme it still wears today. As the 2215 and its sisters aged, the machines would slowly get phased out. By the late 1990s, the remainder of the Class 2200 would enter the final phase of active service. Although the 2215 itself would leave active service in 1999, some of its class members would keep running all the way into 2004, when the curtain finally fell. Entering storage, the fate of the 2215 at first was yet uncertain. In 2002, the machine was purchased by het Spoorwegmuseum, which restored it entirely into working order. In total, 8 of the Class 2200s have been preserved, spread over the heritage railways of the Netherlands. The 2215 is now temporarily part of the Miljoenenlijn collection, where it serves as a recovery locomotive. At the end of the Second World War, the Dutch railways were experiencing a great shortage of material. As part of the modernization effort, most of the railways that were destroyed during the war were immediately electrified when rebuilt. As part of the gradual return to normal, the relatively successful MAT 36 would be visually almost entirely copied for a new batch of rolling stock, the MAT 46. In order to avoid not having sufficient funds, the series of MAT 46 was produced in 4 batches, with the first arriving in 1948 and the last arriving in 1951 and 1952. These electrical multiple units would enter service in either a 4 or 2 carriage configuration, primarily produced by Werkspoor. In total, 65 4-carriage units, numbered NS 641 to 705, and 79 2-carriage units, numbered NS 221 to 299, were ordered and produced. MAT 46 was versatile and could run both express and stop services. Only a 2-carriage unit has been preserved, so we will focus on that variant mostly. It would earn a unique nickname, Muizenneus. In English, that basically means a mice nose. Now, let's talk some numbers. The MAT 46 is a relatively heavy multiple unit, standing at a weight of 89 tons. The traction is delivered by 4 Hemaf electrical motors spread over the front and rear bogies of the unit. Yeah, you heard that right. The MAT 46, at least the 2-carriage configuration, only has 3 bogies, which is called a bow-to-bow configuration. With these 4 motors and the weight of 89 tons, spread over a total length of 44 meters, the machine was able to safely reach speeds of 125 kilometers an hour. Our sole surviving preserved example of the MAT 46 is NS 273. The machine was part of the final batch of the class and was built in the year 1952 by Werkspoor. It would enter service the same year. The biggest change that NS 273 would undergo was the removal of the third-class seating. With the disappearance of third classes entirely on board of international trains in 1956, the NS saw need to remove it from its own trains too. The 273 would stay in service all the way to the 1980s. It would be spared because of Stibans, who would transfer ownership of the multiple unit to the Dutch Railway Museum, het Spoorwegmuseum, in 1987. After receiving a large overhaul in 1996, the NS 273 was put into the permanent collection of the Railway Museum. Sadly, in 2008, the 273 would be involved in a small crash which damaged the machine, with both noses being heavily deformed. After a small time behind closed doors for restoration to take place, the MAT 46 would return onto the main line once again. Now fitted with the well-known ATB-E system, it can also operate excursions and at times can be spotted on the main line to this day. With the eyes set on conquering the world, Germany needed logistical power to support the rapid advance of their armies. Richard Wagner, chief engineer of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, is credited for coming up with the idea of Kriegslokomotiven, which translates to war locomotives. These were larger locomotives meant to move heavy, often military loads. Two already existing classes, the Class 50 and Class 44, were used for this task in the earlier years of the war. However, these two classes were not enough to support the entire war effort, which meant that more machines needed to be built. In order to save precious resources, a simplified design of the Class 50 was created, meant to easily be disposed once peace rendered them no longer needed. This would turn out to be Class 52. From 1942 onwards, the first of the new type of Kriegslok would enter service and mostly take care of supplying the Eastern Front. With the end of the Second World War, the end wasn't even remotely in sight yet for the Class 52. Even better, production of the class did not end with the end of the war, but continued all the way into 1950, when the production finally would come to a halt. In the end, more than 7,000 units were built. Just a quick side note, broadly speaking, the Class 52 was never officially withdrawn from service entirely. Some of these beasts are still officially in service at the Krka coal mines in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which, as you might understand, I think is rather hilarious. In order to understand the magnificence of these large steam-breathing war machines, let's have a look at their statistics and performance. The Class 52 has a total weight of 136 tons. That is including the tender. This weight is spread out over a total length of almost 20.1 meters, which, comparing to the Class 23, which we covered in an earlier episode, is significantly higher. With the 210 wheel arrangement, it is capable of producing a lot of power and move heavy loads with relative ease. However, with small driving wheels also comes a limitation: the speed. Class 52 locomotives are able to reach speed of 80 km an hour, but in stark contrast to some of the larger steam locomotives who have limitations when driving in reverse, this speed is not just for going forwards, but also for going backwards. The locomotive in the spotlight of today's episode, the 52-532, was built 1 year into the production of the new class. Rolling off the production line of the L. Schwarzkopf Berlin factories in 1943, it was immediately put to use shipping goods. We do not know much of the wartime record of the machine, but we can only assume it was used to supply troops at the Eastern Front, just like many of its sisters. In 1945, the 52-532 was transferred to the Soviet Railways and registered as TE 532. It would remain in the service of the Soviets until 1962, when it was returned to its homeland to serve the fleet of the Deutsche Reichsbahn in East Germany. The 52-532 was adopted into the RECO program, which meant upgrades were fitted to make her more cost-efficient. There, the 532 would receive a new number, which was 52-8160, and this number it would carry until it was put aside. In 1949, the original number would be returned when the biggest Class 52 hoarder of the Netherlands would purchase the 52-532, the Veluwse Stoomtreinmaatschappij. The VSM would return the workhorse to a visually somewhat pre-RECO state, removing the typical mixing feed water heater from the top of the boiler. By 2015, the private owner of the locomotive decided a new life was in order for the 532, as it had been sitting idle on a siding at Beekbergen. It was transferred to Simpelveld, where the Miljoenenlijn would start a 10-year-long process of overhauling the 532 and returning it visually to an almost perfect uitbouw state, which was the state it was originally built. This was as part of an agreement in which the Miljoenenlijn would get the machine on temporary loan once it was restored. Finally, in 2025, the 52-532 would show itself to the public once again under its own steam, glistening in the sunlight. What a sight to behold! after receiving all the required boiler tickets for pulling passenger services, and with the E2 1040 in reserve, the 52532 is now responsible for operating the services on the Miljoenenlijn. Awe-inspiring how such a warhorse of dark origins, only meant to last until it could be disposed, manages to survive into the present day. German engineering at its best. One of the inevitable sides of railway history is closing local lines because they are no longer profitable. Germany would also experience this. To keep local lines open, experiments would start in the 1920s to try and find a solution. With the economic situation worsening due to the Wall Street crash of 1929, the need for cost-efficient travel on branch lines was increased. The Landeskleinbahnamt of Hanover would team up with the Waggonfabrik Wismar to create a new type of railbus, which would fulfill those economic needs. The Hanover class railbus would be designed, with its first prototype ready in 1932. After seeing initial successes, a limited production of the Hanover class would start, with a total of 57 machines built. In contrast to most strange experiments, these railbuses were very successful. As a testament to the success of this ugly duckling, 10 examples survived into preservation. Truly incredible. When it comes to the economic side of the machine, it is truly incredible. Some of the local railways that started using the Hanover would report a 150 to 350% increase of revenue. That was all because of the tractive power used to propel the railbus. 2 50 horsepower engines, one at each side of the railbus, each for driving into a different direction. Although not very powerful, this strange creation is able to reach a speed of 56 kilometers an hour. Not all too high, but considering that this thing is not much different from a bus with 2 engines on railway wheels, I would say it does splendidly. Now here comes the fun part. The Hanover class is about 10 meters long and, well, weighs only about 7 tons. I don't know what the designers were smoking, but it seems that worked. Let's get back to the preserved Hanover class railbuses. KDH T1 Wismar was delivered to the Kleinbahn Delmenhorst Harpstedt in 1936 at the price of 26,500 Reichsmark. In order to avoid me butchering a list of German railway company names, I will summarize the next part of its history by saying it exchanged owners in 1936. Then the Second World War broke out, and due to fuel shortages, the T1 was converted to burn gas instead of petrol. By 1951, it would be transferred once again. After being put aside as a reserve in 1968, the T1 would be acquired by Museum Buurtspoorweg MBS in Haaksbergen. When the machine arrived at the MBS, a large overhaul would start, giving the T1 new petrol engines, and modifications would be done to protect more against damage due to collisions. By 2014, the Hanover railbus would receive a second overhaul, with it still being operational as part of the heritage fleet at the MBS to this day. It is a living reminder of how human ingenuity and a little bit of craziness can save regional travel and avoid rural people from being cut off from the outside world. Industrial lower countries were developing in a rapid speed. Even the small town of Sluiskil in the southern part of the province of Zeeland would gain some high-value industry. The Nederlandse Stikstofmaatschappij Sluiskil, better known as NSM. From the start, this industry would focus on the ability to transport product by rail. That is why the NSM would start looking for a locomotive to function as pilot. Atelier de Construction de la Meuse in Belgium was contacted, and an order for one singular 060 short wheelbase tank engine was placed. La Meuse would deliver the locomotive in 1929 to the NSM, where it would receive its designation of NSM No. 1. The delivered example was of the Class 32T. In total, about 46 of these locomotives were built, and several still exist today and survived into preservation, with 2 of them in the Netherlands. The NSM would order several more locomotives, but none of those were of the type 32T. Now, compared to our previous industrial listing from Belgium, this 32T is significantly larger. With a weight of 32 tons and a maximum speed of 35 km an hour, this 7.8 meters long steam locomotive has quite the presence. Sadly, there are those that will see any sign of a blue little tank engine and immediately shout Thomas. To those I say, I think you accidentally got lost on YouTube. At some point in its service life, the NSM-1 would receive a second whistle, like I mentioned in the start of the video. It is hard to find any proper sources on why or when this happened, but a Heritage Railway volunteer did say the whistle originated from a steamboat. Makes sense, considering the noise, I suppose. Let us return to the working life of NSM-1. This particular 32T would continue service at Sluiskil until the year 1971. When it would be purchased by the Museum Buurtspoorweg MBS in Haaksbergen, who would also acquire the little yellow goblin called Magda, also a locomotive built by Lamuse. It was there that the NSM-1 would receive its new number 5. The very same year, the locomotive would be traded against other rolling stock from the stoomtram Hoorn-Medemblik, and the machine would be moved to Hoorn. When starting service in Hoorn, number 5 would also gain a name for itself, Sluiskil. During its time at the SHM, number 5 would be equipped with a tram coupler and buffers, so it is also capable of pulling the historical tram rolling stock. In 1991, Sluiskil would receive a large overhaul, with the entire boiler being replaced. The final change to the locomotive would come in 1999, when the machine would be renamed to Enkhuizen. That is only fitting for a tank engine that works at a heritage tramway, which also has a historical boat service connected to it from the city of Enkhuizen. SHM 5 Enkhuizen is one busy bee and can be regularly seen chuffing along the heritage line in Hoorn. At times, it also returns to Zeeland, running down the heritage railway between Goes and Borselen, close to where its story started in the first place. Say, you are a large manufacturer of chemicals and nutrients in Zutphen, and you need a way of connecting 2 of your factories. What do? Well, of course, you offer your financial support in building a tramway to Emmerik am Rijn, for which plans were already around in the 1890s. The greatest bonus, you would also get a connection to the Emmerik local harbour. With a width of 750 mm, the tramway was perfect for easily manoeuvring through town and village streets. Construction on the first part of the tram line would be finished in 1902, with connections to the larger cities of Arnhem and Doetinchem. The second part of the tram line to Emmerik would be finished only in 1909, which was because of trouble convincing the German city officials on greenlighting the construction. The Tramwegmaatschappij Zutphen-Emmerik, ZE, would order a fleet of 6 tramway engines numbered 1 through 6 at Henschel in Germany. These trams would be finished just in time for the opening of the first stretch of tramway in 1902, and were named after locations which the line passed through. A 7th machine would be constructed in 1904. Vrijland, the mayor of Hummelo and Keppel, who had been a great advocate of the tramway, would be honoured by naming the final edition after him. The 7th fleet member is the very topic of today's episode. Before we go to the history of the ZE7, later known as the ZE607, Let's have a look at the statistics and performance of this tramway engine. This 040 beast has a total weight of 16 tons, which is spread out over a length of 5.6 meters. The machine is very powerful and heavy, reaching only speeds up about 35 kilometers an hour. See, the 1 through 7 were designed with higher power output in mind, as they were supposed to be able to climb up a viaduct over the main line at Emmerich. That viaduct was never built, as the Germans opted for a small tunnel instead. This meant that the ZE 1 through 7 tramway engines were not as cost-effective as one might have hoped. They were built with different expectations from how reality turned out. This makes the next part of history even sadder and, well, avoidable. When the ZE took part in the Gelderse Tramwegen, GTW, in 1934, a decision was made to scrap 3 of the heavy Henschel trams. The remaining trams, numbers 2, 3, 6 and 7, were renumbered to 602, 603, 606 and 607. These would stay in service until 1946, when 2 more machines would end up at the scrapper's torch, the 602 and 606. With the ZE ceasing to exist in 1954, the remaining 2 machines were both retired. 603 was returned to Henschel, as they intended to start a company museum and wished it to be part of that initiative. In 1957, the 607 was brought over to het Spoorwegmuseum, which maintained the machine until the year 2003. By that very same year, the machine was brought over to Stoomtrein Katwijk-Leiden, the SKL, who would finish restoring the machine into working condition in 2024. To run on the 700mm track of the SKL, the machine was re-gauged. It can still be found there today. Around the 1900s, the Dutch railway network was a nice mess. Several railway companies divided the exploitation of the railways amongst themselves, with the Hollandse IJzeren Spoorwegmaatschappij, HSM, being one of the largest. With the expansion of the railway network, the HSM was in need of a new class of tank engines to serve the branch lines in the north of the country. The new class of machines was ordered at Werkspoor, but also at Henschel and Zoon, and finally also at Schwarzkopf in Berlin. By 1905, the first of the new class would enter service. The entire class, known as the HSM 1005 to 1048, would be in service by 1915. A total of 44 machines were ordered, meant for both branch line passenger services and mixed traffic trains. When the Staatsspoorwegen, SS, and the HSM combined their forces in 1921 as the prelude to the nationalization and creation of the Nederlandse Spoorwegen, NS, the class HSM 1005 through 1048 would receive a new designation, the class NS 7700. Once the year 1935 came around, the class NS 7700 would get one new assignment: running steam tram services. This is where our sole survivor comes into the picture. Before we go to the personal history of this railway heritage gem, let's first have a look at the statistics and performance of these little tank engines. The 060 class NS 7700 is a bit different when comparing it to the other tank engines we have discussed before in this series. This one is the first class of tank engine not specifically built for industrial work or shunting duties. As you might imagine, with a length of 8.2 meters, it was still used for shunting anyways, especially in the transitional period to nationalization under the NS. The most surprising detail: at a weight of 28.5 tons, these tank engines are capable of reaching speeds up to 65 kilometers an hour. That is very impressive for a tank engine. As said before, there is only one survivor of the class NS 7700. This is the NS 7742, who is better known as Bello, the nickname given because of the loco's tramway bell. Bello was built in the year 1914 and was part of the final batch of the NS 7700s. The locomotives NS 7737 through NS 7744 would end up at the steam depot in Alkmaar in 1932, where they would receive the adjustments needed to pull tram services to Bergen aan Zee, but also to Egmond aan Zee. Although the services were maintained until 1955, the NS was seeing a steep decline in passengers on these tramways, all because of the widespread usage of cars. By 1955, NS 7742 Bello would pull the very last tram service to Bergen aan Zee. It was the little coastal village itself that would ask the NS to provide them Bello, as they intended to turn her into a monument to remind them of their tramway heritage. Bello would be put on a pedestal in 1960 and would stay there until 1978. When a little heritage railway called Stoomtram Hoorn-Medemblik SHM started looking around for rolling stock, they found Bello relatively quickly. For the symbolic sum of 1 gulden, Bello was sold to the Heritage Railway and the large oval would start immediately. Large parts of the frames needed to be replaced, and the same could be said for the boiler, as most of these parts were damaged by the long exposure to salty sea air. Finally, in 1985, NS 7742 would drive under its own power again, being shown to visitors. Bello still runs to this day, with now plans being proposed to rebuild a full set of her original carriages, one already completed and running along her on the Heritage Line. Some say this little green tank engine doesn't deserve the hype it gets, but I would say it is rather appropriate. It has such an inspiring backstory. In spirit, Bello's story reminds me of a little Ella Niar tram engine in some Anglican reverence children's story.